All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. I saw there was quite a few people in chat saying hi and where they're from, which is great to see. So feel free, jump in, say hi. If you feel like sharing where you're from, go ahead. My name is George, and I'm joined by Dave.
How you
Today,
doing?
we're going to be talking about SRT and all the kinds of cool stuff about it. So I hope everyone has some questions ready for that. We have a Q&A panel. Please use that to ask your questions. We'll get to those towards the end. We'll also have a number of polls come up during the webinar, and there should be one up there now, the first one, just asking what sort of sector do you work in? And that's interesting to us so that we can better understand who's interested in using SRT and how it might help them, because that information helps us determine how we can make your life easier with things like SRT. So, you know, that's part of the goal today. Obviously, with physical distancing and all the crazy things that have been happening through 2020, people have been trying to find new ways to deliver content. And since we introduced SRT into the Pearl line of products earlier this year, we've seen some pretty interesting things and some real excitement around it, which is really fascinating to see. So, what are some of the things that you've seen really quickly, Dave? I'm just seeing our numbers tick up here. So,
Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit about some specific examples, but we've had a lot of customers, especially in the live event space, wanting to bring in, remote guests and conferences and that kind of thing, and just bring the level of video for contributors to, whether they're speaking panels or conferences, just to bring that above kind of the average voice conference quality. So we've seen a lot of people trying to do that. And I think we have an example in here about pro sports, and so we've seen it across the board. People we see what I'd call the traditional broadcast guys shifting away from kind of the satellite truck and really embracing SRT as the way to go, all the way down to more of this kind of style of production.
exactly. So, again, that's the purpose of today is SRT and how we can leverage that for remote video production. So I think we've got a good number of people here. I think our numbers are starting to level off a bit. So maybe let's just take a quick look at what today's agenda is. We're going to break this down into around about 5 different parts. The first one will be a little bit of a primer on what is SRT. Then we'll talk about some of those applications that we just mentioned and dive a little deeper. And then we'll talk about why you might want to choose a Perl for your SRT workflow. And then we'll dive into some specifics around how you would configure SRT to achieve the best results. And we've been doing it enough ourselves, not just internally, but with external partners as well, that we have some pretty good experience and anecdotes to help you with this. And then finally, we'll try and address your questions. And I do see Nick throwing a question into the Q&A panel already, which is great to see. So everyone follow Nick's lead. If you have a question, throw it into the Q&A panel. You'll notice there is an upvote feature in there as well. So if you see someone else's question that looks particularly relevant to what you would like to hear or also ask, then please use that upvote. That will change the priority in which we might answer some of these questions. So feel free to do that. And again, the polls, there's a separate poll panel that's there in Crowdcast for you watching. Weigh in on those questions and the polls as they come up. Like I said, the first one is up there now, so feel free to weigh in on those. So, Dave, maybe take us into the quick primer. What is SRT?
Okay, well, you've got it there. It stands for Secure Reliable Transport. And really what it is it's a transport layer that replaces the transport layer that was really developed for file-based transfer. So it's a video-centric file transfer or image transfer protocol. And, it is very firewall friendly, which makes it easy to deploy. It's obviously secure. That's part of the name. So all the data is encrypted. And most importantly, it's very low latency. And there are some other low latency ways to move data around, particularly video. But as we get into kind of how to configure this and how to work with it in a little more detail, the latency here is configurable, and that gives you a little bit more control over how to go across unpredictable networks. And that's really what SRT was built for. There's lots of ways to go over a very sort of clean network inside of your own, corporate LAN or something where your packet arrival is going to be very well defined and you're not losing a bunch of packets. So in a well-managed network, there are lots of choices. SRT is really meant to take you over those less predictable network choices so that you can still get good quality and still have control over how to tune the algorithm to get that quality, even though you're over a network that's pretty unpredictable.
Yeah, and so I guess the primary way that it does this is that, unlike maybe some of the more traditional publishing methods like RTMP that everyone is probably pretty familiar with these days, it's been around forever, is that that's kind of a just, throw it at the wall and see what sticks kind of approach. You just hope it makes it there, and sometimes it doesn't. Where with SRT, one of the technologies at play here is that there is a secondary back channel of data with diagnostic and packet recovery information that's coming back to your origin. So that not only are we sending obviously the bulk of the data for our stream from one source to the destination, but the destination is also giving us that feedback of information where we can find out round trip time, packet loss, and all these other factors. And we'll dive into that in the configuration part of why those are so important. But aside from that, on the surface, the general flow of using SRT is not unlike most other point-to-point stream publishing methods like RTMP from that standpoint. There's just an extra layer of tech there that gives us that information and really makes that stability increase dramatically.
Yeah, and if you're on a very predictable network, you can still use SRT, obviously, and the setup is much simpler. You can just kind of like RTMP, cut and paste, away you go. But when you get on those less predictable networks or some poorly behaving networks, that's where you want to dive in a little bit more, and SRT gives you that ability to go and tweak things and compensate for what your network's doing.
Absolutely. So the other thing you mentioned there was latency, and that's probably one of the things I think that has been very interesting and partially why SRT was created was the originators of SRT, Haivision, they kind of imagined that SRT could be the replacement for that traditional satellite truck workflow, right? Why send $10 million truck around and still have super high latency and unpredictability when the internet is everywhere, speeds are getting better, networks are getting better, terrestrial networks are getting better. Why don't we leverage that? Let's try and get it as low latency as possible. And for the most part, they've delivered exactly that, which is cool. And as a result, we see low latency options.
Yeah, and a lot of the protocols that we use for streaming video from a server, like a Netflix kind of orientation, that latency isn't so critical because you can buffer a little bit in the player that you're using, and you can tolerate that, and HLS sends that as big video chunks and can replace a whole segment. But when you're in a live streaming contribution kind of mode, that's not the way you want your protocol to behave. And so you do need a low latency protocol, but one that can, as we said, behave well over networks that will have varying inherent latencies and packet losses. And so that's really what SRT delivers. And as this chart shows, you can really tune that latency anywhere from 80 milliseconds up to as much as a second if you needed to. And we've got some specific examples we'll talk about later where we've done some connections around the world with SRT and had to tune things a little bit to compensate for that. So we'll get into those, but for this part, just suffice it to say there's good control there and variation. You can get very low latencies out of it, and if you need to, you can increase that latency to adjust for the network that you're on.
Absolutely. So I mentioned Haivision as being the originators, but the other cool thing about SRT is that it is it is basically an open source, right? It's kind of an open protocol. Yes, they created it, but they opened it up, and they also created something called the SRT Alliance, which is essentially a group of member companies, including Epiphan, that all participate in using SRT on some level, whether it's active and deployed now, or whether they're planning on it and developing it now, or that kind of thing. And this is not all of them. There's 300 plus members in the alliance now. It's this is kind of the top names, I suppose. But people are going to see some familiar names up here. When I look at this, I see so many names that are complementary companies to what we do at Epiphan. Of course, I see our name up there. There's competitors up there too, but that's one of the reasons why it's so interesting is that the alliance gets together sometimes and does these fun interop things to test against each other's stuff just to see what happens, and that's, to me, in the technology world, that's kind of a new thing. It's not that common to do. Competitive analysis is one thing, but intentional interop testing during development, that's kind of a new thing to see that level of cooperation, which is pretty cool that it's based around this protocol. But the other thing is the types of companies up here. There's CDNs up here. There's camera manufacturers. There's hardware encoder manufacturers like us. There's just about anything you could imagine. One of those companies is up there, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, and this is really important for people looking to make use of the protocol. Obviously, you want that choice of platforms to send your SRT to, or encoders that you want to employ on site. So that list, as you said, is huge, and it's growing. And we're starting to see a lot of use in the field, which is only going to draw more competitors in. So I think Haivision's done a really excellent job. And Wowza was the other kind of founding member, and they've done a really great job of promoting this technology, bringing lots of diverse companies on board. So it's not all just CDNs or encoders, or it's just about everything to do with video production and video processing and transport. You can find many companies in just about every segment that belong to the alliance. So it's growing quickly, and it's already to the point where it can be deployed easily because there are so many manufacturers that have jumped in and put this on their products.
Yeah. And speaking of Wowza, not that long ago, but a while ago, we did do one of these webinars with Tim from Wowza, who joined us and talked all about this kind of stuff and how you specifically configure pearls with Wowza and things along those lines. So if you're interested in, learning a little more hands-on about how Perl and Wowza work together, go and check the back catalog of webinars that we've done on our website, epiphan.com/webinars. You'll see all the previous webinars there. Check the one out with Wowza. It was great to sit down and chat with Tim, which I've had the pleasure of doing several times. And, it's always great to chat with people at Wowza about, how they're helping deliver the content that people are creating with, Epiphan pearls and other stuff, which is great. So let's take a quick look at one of the ways that kind of SRT was used, I suppose, in, a major traditional broadcast method. Kind of came in and saved the day in the pandemic environment. And that was actually during the NFL draft reflections. They needed to deploy something that just had a huge number of contribution endpoints, funneling it all back and getting into a more traditional broadcast workflow. And they used SRT for that. So it's pretty amazing. That must have just been absolutely fascinating to be a part of building that. That to be a fly on the wall would have been just really interesting. But this is something where ultimately the people who were watching that event probably didn't even realize what was happening. They were just looking at it going, man, that's way better quality than I get in my Zoom call. And the reason for that is because SRT was providing that backbone.
Yeah, and I think it's no surprise that kind of the broadcast guys were the ones to use this first at such a huge scale, right? So they really stepped up and said, we want this, as you said, fed back into our traditional broadcast system as though all of these guys are in studio, and you're getting high quality images of them all, which was really cool. And I think they had something like 600 or more than 600 feeds coming into that broadcast. So that was a massive kind of test for the protocol and for the integration of the protocol into other equipment. So it did really well.
So the other one that we've seen, in terms of the headlines, is that SRT has also been used by NASA and SpaceX during some of the recent launches to sort of move data quickly at that really low latency from one control room to another, so that they have a better sense of what's going on. For example, SpaceX, their main course sort of mission control is not in Houston with NASA's necessarily. They're located in other places, and so making sure that all these places have a view of what each other is doing as we see this growth of public and private partnerships in space. This kind of information management and movement is critical, and it's another place where we've been lucky to see that's been deployed and used a little bit. So that's super cool as well.
Yeah, and in these launches, they're also much more media friendly than NASA has been in the past. And so you have that, not only the internal video of these teams exchanging information, but also then feeding into all of the media outlets and things. So there's a huge kind of deployment of SRT behind the scenes to make all this stuff happen. And it's very impressive.
So I'm guessing most of our viewers are not the NFL or NASA or SpaceX, and are wondering, okay, that's cool, but that's, all the money in the world. So what does it really mean? What are some of the realistic applications, and what does it look like from a technology perspective for maybe, the more average deployment? And that's where we wanted to touch on some of the more real world, not necessarily the grand headline applications of doing this. So let's talk a little bit about those and how we deploy it. So as we mentioned before, typically, we would have some sort of source encoder. On this slide, we're representing that with our upcoming Pearl Nano, and there's a good reason for that. We'll maybe dive a little deeper on that later on. But something that's operating as an SRT encoder, feeding that across the internet to a destination, whether that's a CDN like Wowza ingesting it directly, or whether that's a production system that's ingesting it and then doing something else with it. But we have that back channel of diagnostic data, so we can get a picture of what's going on with our network very easily. We're not just guessing, and we can make adjustments if necessary. So the typical top layer flow is pretty familiar, I think, to people. Where I think it gets interesting, and this is exactly what, Dave, you and I are doing right now, right?
Yeah, we're bringing in our feeds into our production over SRT, and using our pearls to do so. So George and I are both located in our homes today during this broadcast, and we're using our pearls to send SRT to the production hub, which is being powered by Pearl, and then from there out to Crowdcast, and that's where you see us. So this is exactly the example we're doing, and of course you can combine these examples, so you can bring in remote guests and send SRT out also to the CDN that you're going to if it supports it. And you can obviously bring in multiple guests. So it's easy to kind of scale this up and bring multiple SRT connections in. And so that you can, for conferences, bring in multiple people on a panel, for example, and be able to kind of scale that up quite easily, as each SRT connection is completely independent. So you've got individual audio and video for each participant, and then you can mix and switch them however you like into the production.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting ways of doing this is that, not only are we going to be able to mix and switch and aggregate, all those multiple people, multiple guests into a single production hub, but like you said, Dave, you could be sending SRT back out, but you could also be sending out simultaneously when, in the case of something like Pearl 2, if that's your production hub, we could be sending RTMP to Crowdcast, SRT to Wowza, RTMPS to Facebook, HLS somewhere else, Dash somewhere else. Given we have enough bandwidth, we're not limited here to strictly one protocol. Our production hub can do some translation to flip that into something else, to reach whatever our final platform might be. And that's a big benefit, and can really kind of open up the flexibility of where you deliver the content ultimately.
Yep.
So what we're really talking about there is contribution encoding, right? And so again, to kind of give you a picture of what contribution encoding would look like in this case is, we're using, again, an SRT source of some kind. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about Pearl Nano in a moment and why we think it's a great fit for this. But there's cameras out there that have SRT built in. There's software that has SRT available as well. They all basically function, from an SRT perspective in the same way. They just have some pros and cons to them for some other things. That gets sent to your broadcast production system. Again, we're using a Pearl 2 as our production hub, but there are other options as well. And then ultimately passing that on to the CDN, and then ultimately on to the viewer, the player, whatever that might be. Again, you might be, if you're a big, traditional television broadcast studio, you might be translating that ultimately to television broadcast as opposed to live streaming. And that's where, this really becomes pretty powerful.
We've got a couple polls that people can respond to. The first one, have you used SRT yet? So are you one of the ones who's ventured out and tried it out, got some experience with it? And the other one is around how often you bring remote guests into a production. So is that a use case that you see often or you're involved with often? That's something we'd love to know. So do go respond to those polls when you get a second, and let us know whether you've used SRT and whether you're one of the ones that's likely to use it for something like bringing in remote guests.
Yeah. And funny enough, one of the questions, and I do see some more questions being put in the Q&A panel, which is awesome. Keep them coming. One of the top one, the first one, and the most upvoted one from Nick was saying, can you use SRT via a mobile phone network router, that kind of thing? And that I read that question out now simply because it is relevant context-wise to exactly the slide we have up next, and that is SRT encoding. Hardware, software, what do I use? There is not necessarily a right or wrong answer here, but there are considerations to take. There are hardware encoders on the market, like Epiphan Pearls. Typically, when you're looking at dedicated hardware encoders, not just for SRT, but in general, you're looking at things that are more reliable, fewer points of failure. You're dealing with a single company to call if you're running into support issues. They can often be more flexible, easier to operate, and sometimes much simpler to set up. On the software side, sometimes that's a lower upfront investment. They're definitely more readily available. I mean, you could download OBS anytime you want, unless you're using Big Sur. Joke from pre-production chat. And you can run it on your standard computer. And to Nick's question specifically, there are also mobile phone apps that will use your phone's camera and then stream SRT out from the app. In combination of that question, there is no limitation if you're using like an LTE 4G hotspot. You can absolutely do that with SRT as well. Obviously, you need to be very careful and double check how much bandwidth you're actually getting over that connection. And if you're, because let's be honest, cellular connections are the least reliable things when it comes to data, especially upstream data. But if you have a strong signal, you're getting good bandwidth, and you're setting within those limits, yeah, absolutely. You can run it from your phone. You can run it from another device connected to some sort of LTE hotspot. And that's, I think, a big part of actually what was envisioned for the protocol in general as well, and why there are options for it to more easily traverse firewalls. And we'll dive into some of those modes in a moment. But there are multiple modes within SRT. Some are going to help you more in certain circumstances than others. And mobile cellular networks are a big one, where one mode in particular is going to be much easier than some of the other options. So we'll touch on that. But if you're looking to install an app and run it on a mobile device, we've touched on that in previous webinars and our live shows as well. But Haivision has their own app called Haivision Play. And there's some other companies that are creating some as well. There's an app called Rivet, which is in beta right now. We've played with it a fair bit. It has some cool stuff to make it easier to set up, but we've found it to be somewhat unreliable, if I'm honest. But it is beta, so, I'll cut a bit of slack. But they have mobile apps as well as a Windows app now, I believe, for that. But yeah, there's lots of options. Like we mentioned earlier, there's so many companies involved in the alliance now that chances are whatever you're looking for is out there already. You just need to find it. But of course, one of the ones we mentioned there was hardware encoders. That just so happens to be our specialty and kind of a big part of what we do here. So we wanted to really talk about why you might choose a Pearl for SRT, for your hardware encoding. So Dave, maybe talk to us a little bit about Pearl.
Sure. One of the reasons to go to a dedicated kind of hardware appliance versus the software approach or the mobile approach is that platforms like Pearl are purposely built for video encoding. So from the hardware that's inside them to the way they're constructed and the UI, everything it's not a general purpose computer or a phone. It's a purpose-built encoding engine. And that generally means it's going to be easier to use, and a little bit more higher quality and reliability. So you're looking at one whole package that's tested as a complete package to do one particular job. If you take an app and load it on your Windows or your Mac, you've got lots of competing applications on a platform that's meant to do many things. They're very capable, but they can be difficult to debug if you run into issues. And so if you load it on and everything goes great, that's good. If it doesn't go great, it's a lot harder to find out what's going wrong and get support and get it working. So our Pearl encoders, as I said, are purpose-built appliances that are meant to do that job very specifically, and to do it with ease of use in mind. So nice big touch screen, easy way to set up. You can be shown how to do this very quickly, and we'll get into some of the setup kind of later on in the webinar.
Yeah, and again, our goal in terms of producing this hardware, whether it's for SRT or otherwise, sort of our whole approach is we want to create a hardware device that's versatile, reliable, as easy to use without sacrificing power and flexibility, and is going to offer a professional quality device. And SRT is just one component of kind of those main pillars. So specifically within what we really see things happening in terms of this remote production workflow with SRT, from a hardware perspective, kind of is made up of two parts, really. Using something like a Pearl 2 as a production hub, since Pearl 2 could bring in as many as 6 SRT inputs, so remote SRT streams coming into a Pearl 2. And you can create then multiple output streams, multiple encoded video streams or recording or whatever you need to do. In order to simplify things, and of course sending individual contributors Pearl 2s is a little crazy, and so using something like our upcoming Pearl Nano, we see is actually a fantastic fit to complete the picture. Now, full disclosure, Dave and I are both using Pearl Minis in our homes at the moment for this, but both of us could easily be using Pearl Nanos going forward once there's a few more units available, which of course they're not for sale quite yet. They will be soon. Once that does happen, I will gladly switch to a Nano in my home instead of using a Pearl Mini, which I'm barely utilizing its capabilities for what I do from a contribution perspective. So with Pearl Nano going forward, from a contribution standpoint, it'll have the ability to send that one SRT stream out, which you can then ingest in your production hub. It has a single encoded channel with a single video program mix if you are wanting to do some picture-in-picture or side-by-side without overcomplicating a lot of that work for the end user. And that could mean that you are providing them something that's very simple and straightforward to set up. They connect their video sources like a camera, their audio. They can get some confidence monitoring right on the front of the box like other Pearl models. They have a start stream button right on the front, which means you could pre-configure this thing and ship it to someone. They just plug in a few cables and they push that stream button and you start ingesting it on your production hub on the other side. They have an HDMI pass-through that they could connect another display for better confidence monitoring for themselves, which helps a lot. I mean, I use the tiny display on my camera to look at myself, but sometimes having a bigger one is nicer and just helps you with your eye line settings and things like that. So there's a lot of things that are going to be built into the Nano that are going to help those endpoint contribution, sending that into your production workflow. The other part, of course, of using Pearl products in this workflow is end-to-end control and configuration. So it is possible to remotely connect to the Pearl hardware by a remote producer, and that way the on-screen talent, the on-camera talent, doesn't necessarily have to know or be involved in the configuration. And yes, it's theoretically possible to do this with a computer with some software through like remote desktop and stuff like that. But you have to ask yourself, do you really want to expose that computer to remote desktop to someone remote? Maybe not. If it's your personal machine, probably not. Could even be considered a security problem depending on who you work for. Dedicated hardware prevents that sort of security vulnerability because that hardware only does one thing. It doesn't store any personal information. It only takes that and streams that, and that's all. So allowing a remote producer access to dedicated hardware is far less risk involved there and can be much more secure. It also means that as the on-camera person, I don't have to do any of that stuff. The producer can configure it, make changes if they need to, and they can be doing that for the remote contributors and the production hub at the same time, which is a pretty powerful workflow, I think. And this is the area. This slide to me is what really pops out at me as to what people are asking about, looking for, and I think even post-pandemic, whatever that looks like, is going to be a workflow that's going to carry forward forever, really. This is, now that box has been opened, this is where people want to go.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people, they're used to connecting through voice conferencing like Zoom and this kind of stuff. When you ship them something that's going to be SRT based, it needs to be easy, it needs to be reliable, and the best way to do that is allow the producer to do the configuration and in real time be able to adjust those things so that, as you said, the talent doesn't need to configure it. They don't need to know how to do it. They just need to be on camera and they can let the producer manage all of that complexity. And we'll get into, what the complexity looks like in setting up SRT in a little bit. It's not terribly difficult for those familiar, but if you're just inviting someone to be on a panel on a show, you don't want to be educating them on how to set up their SRT connection. Right. So that remote control becomes very, very convenient and I would say essential for most productions where you don't want your talent, A, either being distracted during the show, having to adjust things, or B, you having to educate them beforehand on how to watch for problems and how to correct them. We're going to get into how to configure SRT, right? That's kind of the next step. And as we mentioned at the very beginning, there's kind of two elements to SRT. There's that upstream element where you're sending SRT, say, as a contribution feed to the production hub, but you're also getting statistics back. And so you're able to see a few really key parameters that allow you to understand what's going on with your connection, but also to be able to tune that connection and to be able to get the most out of whatever unpredictable network you have. And here we're showing what some of those stats are. So in the statistics section there, kind of in the middle of the screen, you see things like the round trip time, the latency, the packet loss percentage. So this is giving you information in real time about how your internet connection is performing on that connection that you're over. So using that information, you can tune the SRT protocol to give you kind of the best performance video and audio wise over that unreliable connection. So in this case, we've got a pretty good connection. Packet loss is less than 1%, which is quite good. The latency is something that we're setting ourselves. And we'll get into kind of how to set the latency, but that is probably the key parameter and the key lever that you have as somebody configuring SRT to be able to get the most out of the connection that you have. And the round trip time, that's the time to basically send data up to the endpoint and back. And that's an important statistic to keep in mind as well. So you will see the round trip time and the packet loss. Those are two kind of input variables that you need to be aware of. And then we're going to do a calculation on what that latency looks like as a result of that, or what latency you want to select in order to get really good performance. In terms of the actual connection itself, it's fairly simple. You need a URL, so you need to know, okay, where am I sending this SRT connection? Very similar to an RTMP or RTMPS connection. You need some ingestion endpoint that you're going to direct this SRT stream to. And then there's a few simple kind of configurations like encryption. You can choose to have it encrypted or not. And if it is encrypted, you can choose the length of your encryption key and those kind of things. And then you see the latency box near the bottom there. And that's really that parameter that we're adding or that we're calculating and putting in. And so we'll have a chart later where we talk about the different latencies we've selected depending on the different networks and conditions that we're in. But generally, for me, I have a pretty poorly performing internet connection from my home. So I'm typically in the 200 to 300 millisecond latency is what I end up selecting. But that's just really the one parameter. So once you understand what's going on with your connection, you need a URL to connect, and then you're going to set a latency, and then you're ready to go.
One of the top ones you mentioned there, Dave, kind of the first thing to choose is the SRT connection modes. And essentially there's three different specific SRT modes that you can choose from. There's caller, listener, and rendezvous. Caller, listener work hand in hand. These names are logical. It's pretty easy to understand what they mean. It's literally like making a phone call. Someone initiates, someone answers. So in this case, that's exactly what Dave and I are doing right now. Is our pearls in our homes are acting as callers, and our production hub is taking them in as listener inputs. So they're just sitting there in standby, waiting for our callers to initiate the connection. This is the most stable by far to use, and in some ways the one that you need to know the least about funny networking stuff in a way, provided that your production hub can open up some inbound ports in some ways. Rendezvous, basically two endpoints, doesn't really matter which one is the source, which one is the receive. They basically call each other and meet in the middle. And it's a fascinating technology in the way it works. And it is by far the best way to traverse firewalls without being able to, or worrying about connecting or configuring those firewalls or port forwards or any of that stuff. The drawback is that you need to know each other's public IPs. And that ultimately can be a bit of a challenge. Coming back to some of the questions we had on mobile, Rendezvous is actually a great way to use mobile to some degree, but not always. You sometimes have to use VPNs to get around things. So there's a number of things there that, again, your mileage may vary depending on your specific network conditions and what other things might be involved. But unlike more traditional protocols, you have these options. You can go with what's going to make sense. I think there were some questions about just getting SRT over an internal network, a local network. You can absolutely do that as caller listener flawlessly, because all you need is the IPs of the different your caller needs to know the IP of your listener, and that's it. So that's very, very simple and easy to do. Again, Rendezvous is definitely going to be better for traversing uncontrollable firewalls. Let's say you're someday post-pandemic in a hotel trying to run an event, and the hotel IT staff are not particularly friendly to helping you along that. Rendezvous is probably the best way to get out of that and into your other side. So some cool ways that you can leverage some of these modes. So Dave, you also talked about connection tuning. Let's talk. You mentioned some of the things you do. There are some, I guess, rough guidelines. I've personally found these are a bit, maybe not quite as real world, but this is the theory. Yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of where you start from, right? At least this gives you an idea. So as I mentioned, there's a round trip time and a percent packet loss that you'll see in your SRT statistics once you set up the connection. And so you take those two inputs and you calculate what's called an RTT multiplier based on your percentage of packet loss. So in the first column there, we see, your worst case loss rate. So if you're at less than 1% of packet loss, then your multiplier is generally 3. And as your packet loss increases, if you're one of those very unfortunate people who have, say, 7% packet loss, which is pretty miserable, then you're up to a multiplier of 5. And so the idea is you just select from the second column the multiplier that corresponds to the packet loss that you have on the connection that you're already connected over. You take that number and then multiply it times the round trip time to come up with the latency. So in the example we have here, we're saying the round trip time is 20 milliseconds. And if I had less than 1% packet loss, I would choose a multiplier of 3 and end up with 60 milliseconds as the minimum latency that I would want to set up for that SRT connection. I can always set up a greater number and give the protocol kind of more breathing room. This is kind of setting that basement level to say you should at least have 60 milliseconds. And as your packet loss changes or your round trip time changes, generally those things don't change greatly once you've connected. But if you're moving about, one day you're in one place, one day you're on a different connection, you may find that one day you connect and your packet loss is great, and then you go to some other location and it's not as great. Then that's when you want to pull out this table. But generally, I think our experience certainly has been from my house, it's pretty predictable. I set the same latency all the time. From your house, I know you have really great connection. You can get away with very minimal latency. So it's not like this calculation has to be done, many, many times if your internet connection is fairly consistent. And that doesn't mean it's perfect. It just means it behaves as badly tomorrow as it did yesterday, or as well tomorrow as it did yesterday. So once you get to know what your connection behaves like, you can pretty much just dial in your latency each time you connect and kind of leave it at that setting.
Yeah, we have some examples of that in a moment. Just to give people an idea, I'll play a little bit of a fun game here. But when I look at my stats right now, my round trip time is about 36, 37 milliseconds. To match up with what Dave's sending, I've increased my latency to match his so that we're on the same sort of delay. I could easily be setting, if we follow that table, we do a 3-time multiplier, right? I could be setting a 90 to 100 millisecond latency, and I've done it at that, and it does work. My usual choice is about 120 when connecting this way as a minimum, because I like to play it safe. But oftentimes I'm doing these webinars with other people who are either geographically farther away or have weaker connections. And so they end up being the lowest common denominator, and we need to kind of make sure everyone's at that level. So 2 to 300 is still what I end up using to match. But if I was doing it by myself, I could easily do 120 pretty safely. So, my packet loss is, at these kind of settings is always, so far below a fraction of 1% that we don't even register it in the stats, basically. Like if I look at it now, I've out of something like, I don't know, I did stop and restart my SRT stream to help debug that audio glitch. I don't think that actually helped, but I did it just because it was easy to do. But since I restarted it, I've sent several 100,000 total packets and I've only lost 7. So, I mean, these are the kind of stats you get from SRT. I have that information in my Perl that I can see right in front of me so that I can easily know whatever it is that I'm sending and what I'm doing. So again, the formula there is, determine it with round trip times, your multiplier, and that's going to equal the latency setting you should be using. Of course, your bit rate, your encoding bit rate still plays a role in this in terms of you still cannot exceed the bandwidth that you have. I'm able to safely send a 5 megabit stream out from my home because my connection can support that. Right before we jumped on the sort of our pre-production call, Dave, you mentioned your internet connection today was struggling a little bit.
It is. I've lost 27,000 packets since we started our little connection here, and my packet loss bounces around between. It gets as low as 0.1, but it gets as high as about 3.5 to 4. And I've got a longer round trip latency than you do. So I'm up at around 45, 46 milliseconds. So that's why we end up with a number that's in the 200 or 300 range for the latency. George could get away with a whole lot less than that, but my connection is much less well behaved. And so what we do is select similar latency settings so that we remain synced up, but it's able to tolerate the connection that I have from my home. So you kind of manage, if you have multiple of these SRT connections, you kind of manage them as a group, figure out which one is the most kind of problematic, and then set everybody's latency to that. And that tends, you don't have to do that. You could have them all on their own individual latencies, but we like to have everything kind of synced coming into our Perl 2 at the production side. And so we set everybody the same.
And part of that is because we do our content creation as a conversation. If we were just doing straight handoffs between Dave and I talked for 10 minutes and then handed off to Dave and he talked for 10 minutes, then it wouldn't matter. But, the way we choose to create content, we need to be in sync. So we've done a number of these webinars with remote guests, and so this is kind of just mostly a fun graphic, but just kind of represents some of the settings that we have used in some of our production. And we really are talking about doing this globally. So Dave and I are both geographically relatively close to our head office where we host kind of our production hub. And so we can, most of the time achieve pretty good latencies. Let's say inside of Ottawa, Canada, 100 milliseconds should be achievable. But when we have some of our colleagues join us from our office in California, just due to the geographic distance, and quite honestly, it seems like Silicon Valley connections are somehow really terrible, we often have to increase that, and sometimes that starts at about 200 milliseconds. Quite some time ago, we had some of the guys from BirdDog, a company based in Australia, who make some awesome cameras. And I saw some questions that I might tell you guys to go investigate BirdDog a little bit. We had them join us for one of our webinars. And coming from down under, we had to set a 500 millisecond latency just due to geographics. We're still talking way, way lower latency than if we were doing this over something like an RTMP stream. We would be talking about 5, 10, 20 seconds potentially in that type of environment. So SRT, although yes, a link from Australia is much, much higher than locally, it's still way lower than other streaming technologies. So it's still a big benefit. Very recently, I was a guest on some webinars that our partner in the Netherlands and in Belgium were doing, and they were hosting it. I was sending an SRT stream to them instead of someone coming to us for once, which was fun. I could have probably done 200 milliseconds, but my packet loss was just a little higher than I liked. I was sometimes inching over 1%. And so I chose to go to 300 milliseconds, which took me to basically zero packet loss, absolute stability, and it was fantastic. And really, the difference between 200 and 300 milliseconds, considering I'm crossing the ocean, is nothing. So, I mean, I remember as a kid talking to people in Europe on the phone. The latency across the hard lines under the ocean was longer than that. So this is, in terms of technology, this is a big, big difference. And I see. And Jonas, I see him just commenting in chat. Who is at Intronics, our partner there in Belgium, and he was saying, we did 300, but we just kind of rough guessed at it. We probably could have done less. Yeah, we definitely probably could have, but we have the option of playing it safe, and that's really one of the big differences with SRT. You have the option of playing it safe. So why not? If I remember correctly, I think my round trip time to Belgium was about 120, 130 milliseconds. So again, I could get away with a bit less, but following that table, I did choose about the right multiplier for that. Right. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, because this question inevitably comes up, and that is, okay, we have all these remote contributors. There is latency, always, to some degree, little, sometimes larger. How do people communicate in these scenarios? And can we do all of it over SRT?
Yeah, and I think, yes, the answer is yes, you can. But as we've discussed, if you're going to do this kind of natural conversation, you're going to need to have a pretty well-performing network to do that all within SRT. So certainly if you're, say, in a campus and you're in a couple different buildings, but that network is quite well known and well engineered, then certainly you could do it all through SRT. And with something like our Pearl 2, you could be receiving multiple back channels and creating those, minus mixes for each of your guests so they don't hear themselves. So it is possible to bring in the video and audio from each of your guests and give them feedback, so they would see visual feedback and hear you and be able to interact with you naturally. But you would need to be setting that SRT latency to kind of that 80 to 100 millisecond range, which implies you've got
maybe less.
Yeah, maybe less. And so then you've got to have a really well-performing network with a very short round trip time. And of course, as I said, if you're in just different buildings on a campus, your round trip time is going to be very small. Once you get beyond that kind of, I'll call it well-behaved, well-engineered, well-controlled network, then it becomes a lot more difficult to have a natural conversation, because as we just discussed, you've got conflicting requirements. In one case, you want to increase your latency to play it safe and make sure your SRT connection is stable and performing really well. And the other hand, in order to have that natural conversation, it makes you want to drive that number as low as possible. And so what we tend to do instead is we let that latency go higher for our SRT connections. And then we use a separate mechanism for the back channel. And that's what we're doing today. So George and I are actually conversing with each other through Zoom. So I'm hearing George through Zoom and he's seeing and hearing me through Zoom. At the same time, we're sending our feeds through SRT to that production Pearl. And that's what's creating the event that you see over Crowdcast. So we're kind of doing both in parallel. And what that allows us to do is the Zoom call can be that immediate natural interaction with very low latency. And if the quality isn't perfect, that's okay. I can still hear George. I can tell what he's saying. And if his video is not great, that's okay too. I can still generally see what he's doing. But we want our quality from an audio and video perspective to be much better for the broadcast. And so that's why we split these two things up. It allows us to set the latency higher on SRT to get a really well-performing connection or deal with a poorly performing connection. And at the same time, still have a natural conversation with a faster sort of low latency, and I would say lower quality back channel, but good enough quality that we can converse.
Yeah. So instead of doing this, where, you can absolutely do this, as we've said, where, you have different things coming in, you have things going out and back channel communications coming in. And then you also have, your hub doing in and outs all over the place. You can absolutely do that. But again, that'll be a struggle with high latency. So instead we do this. Nick mentioned, but that's why you didn't know his audio had gone down. Well, that's partially true. Yes, you guys did alert us. The other person in our Zoom back channel is our producer, Cameron, and Cameron noticed at the same time as you guys did and was trying to figure it out. So again, because we happen to have that third party who's running the producing and doing that element of it, they noticed. They were on top of it. It honestly, even if we had done all the back channels through SRTs and everything like that, yeah, Dave would have said, "Oh, I'm not hearing George anymore." It probably wouldn't have changed the actual troubleshooting or resolution of it, to be honest. So I could see your point, Nick, but I don't think it actually would have changed anything. So the end result was basically the same. But again, my setup here, I actually have two microphones. My top quality one is going into my Pearl along with my camera. And then I have a pretty low quality microphone and earbuds going into my Zoom call to have that natural conversation with Dave. I don't necessarily need video in that Zoom call. We could literally be talking on the phone and accomplish the same thing. The main key is that it is real time there and isolated from our production mix for a number of things. Again, when we ran into that technical glitch, Cameron was talking to me in my ear, and you guys, or the viewers, couldn't hear that because we had that back channel. So for this type of production, this is actually one of the better ways to do it. So it works very well. And it doesn't have to be Zoom. We mentioned Zoom because we happen to be Zoom customers. That's what we use every day. But it, like I said, it could be a phone call. It could be Google Meet, which I've also done with some people's productions. It could be whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Just some other parallel real-time chat.
Yeah. And if it does include video, then you have the option of taking your production feed out of Pearl. So the same feed that we're sending to Crowdcast, we're feeding that back into the Zoom call as another participant, so I can actually see when Cameron's switched away from me and you see only George on the screen. I can take a sip of my water. So we can actually see what's going on in the production feed because we're using a visual back channel. And that allows us that freedom to see what's going on, see which, whether you're seeing full screen slides or whether you're seeing us. So it just gives us that extra little confidence. But as George said, for the conversation part of it, it could just be a phone call. It could literally be anything that allows you to communicate by voice.
Yeah, and this has been working extremely, extremely well for us for, I guess, about 8 months now. So this has been delivering what we need it to do, with very few exceptions where we've needed to get a little more creative. But this has been the backbone.
Yep.
So I think we're going to dive into some questions. So if you have questions and you haven't already put them in the Q&A panel, now would be the time to do that. If you haven't weighed in on our polls, please do that as well. There's a few polls in there, so take a look at those, and just weigh in and see what's going on. And then I'm going to start looking through some of these questions. It looks like we have a good number of them. So I'm just going to start from the top. So please use that upvote as well. And that's going to help us triage some of these questions. So I'm going to start right off the top with Richard Fox asking, how about using it with bonded cellular connections? That should be no problem in caller listener, but would be pretty much a no-go in rendezvous. The reason for that is that with rendezvous, you have to know each other's IPs. With bonded connections, your IP could change as you switch between your primary or something like that. It depends on how your bonding's being done. You could also end up in a situation where you are double natted. Basically, what you think your public IP address, in fact, is not. This happens on cellular connections pretty much all the time. Cool for security, not so great for SRT rendezvous mode. So again, yes, you can with some conditions there. And I would say caller listener is what you ultimately want to do over bonded cellular. The next question, Dave, maybe I'll have you answer this one from Kevin, just saying, to access a Pearl remotely, does the device's IP have to be known, or does it connect to a management platform to allow control?
Great question. So yes, it connects to a management platform. So you need to pair it once. And the platform for us is AV Studio or Epiphan Cloud. So we have a management platform. You pair it once. So in our case, if we were sending, say, a Pearl Nano out to a guest that we wanted to bring onto the show, we would pair that with our account, and then we would send it to the guest. And once the guest plugs that into a public network, it would reach back to that platform. We'd be able to see the device from there, and then we'd be able to remotely control it and log into it and manage it from there. So you don't have to know the IP address of the device. There is a pairing mechanism, and the way the pairing works is simple. You plug it in, it will give you a code on the front or in the web UI. You take that to the platform, enter the code, and then the device is paired with your account. And anytime the device is then publicly available, you'll be able to see it in that platform and manage it from there.
Yeah, exactly. There are some other ways. Some people, and I'm not recommending this, but some people have chosen to, enter port forwarding rules or things like that so that they could connect directly to Pearls that way. That's not the most secure way to do it. Doing it through the cloud, as Dave was talking about, that is creating a secure tunnel. It's encrypted. So can you get around that in a less secure manner? Yes, you absolutely can, but I can't say that I would recommend it. So that's I've seen people also remote desktop to another computer inside the network and then connect to it. There's a few ways you can do it, Kevin. Ultimately depends on what your infrastructure is, how much control you have over the network. So I think we answered this, but this was from Richard as well. What latency are you guys getting now from your homes to your production hub, and what's the data rate? We kind of touched on this maybe after you asked this, Richard, but we're using an intentional latency, both of us, of 300 milliseconds in order to compensate for Dave's internet connection being a bit funny today. Normally, when Dave and I do these webinars, we can do 200 milliseconds, no problem. Today is just a bit funny. I'm going to blame the fact that it's snowing. And data rates, they're a bit different. I'm using 1080p at 5 megabit for my video. Dave, I think you're going a little lower than that, right?
Yeah, I actually bumped it down for today just because we were a little worried about the stability of my connection. So I'm at 720 and I'm going at 2.5 megabits.
Yeah. So although I'm using double the bit rate that Dave is, again, my upload speed is fine with that. In this case, because the type of content we're producing, the talking head, if you will, you guys are not going to notice a significant difference between 1080 at 5 meg and 720 at 2.5 meg. Once we do the cropping and stuff that's being done at a production level, you guys ultimately aren't going to see a huge difference in the image quality of that. So you can definitely mix and match that a little bit. Serge was just asking here, what is the minimum network required for SRT to work? I mean, there isn't really a clearly defined one. I mean, it's no different than any other live streaming, which ultimately comes back to what your upload speed is, and then setting your encoding to fit within that. So if we kind of talk about it from a general streaming perspective, let's say, for example, we want to stream at 720p, and a decent minimal bit rate for that might be as low as 1.5 megabit. You would want an upload speed of at least, 2.5, 3 megabit bare minimum, in order to support that stream. So for me, 1080 at 5 megabit, generally speaking, I would want 8 to 10 megabit stable upload speed to support that. Dave's using 2.5. So, you would maybe want somewhere between 4.5, 5 megabit, to support that stable to be safe. You could certainly cut the margins closer, but that's that's up to you, and of course the bandwidth available. SRT doesn't have a specific requirement because it's essentially just a wrapper, right? And it depends on what you put inside it, and that's why the bit rate has a bigger impact than anything else. And I did see a comment here in chat, what's the highest quality available to send out? And I'm just calling that one out because it's somewhat related. Matt, essentially, again, SRT is essentially just a container, a wrapper, and you can put pretty much anything you want into it. If you want to stream at 4K at 30, 40, 50 megabit, you totally can, assuming you have the bandwidth to support it. But good luck with that. That's a different question. But yeah, I mean, assuming that you have bandwidth, sure, why not? You can definitely do it in 4K if you really want, or down the line higher. SRT is not limited to that. So, Stephen was asking an interesting question here. Does Epiphan hardware support multi-audio channels yet? Stephen, did you mean as inputs or as outputs in a stream? There's an important reason I'm asking for clarification on that. So throw it into chat if you're still there, Stephen. Stephen also asked, what about tally support for cameras in remote locations? This is an interesting one where I actually come back to, and this is the one that caught my eye and made me think of Bird Dog. Again, the cool thing about SRT being this sort of transport protocol means that you can put almost anything inside of it. So there are companies out there that are usually camera companies that are creating methods of including communication things like tally into their software, some of which is leveraging SRT translated to NDI and then using NDI's tally systems. That's one of the things that Bird Dog's experimenting with, Bird Dog Cloud and their NDI cameras. So there's some cool things happening there. Again, it's just a matter of people choosing to use that. The protocol itself can absolutely, wrap that, no problem.
And the protocol is evolving. That's the other thing is we talk about SRT as though it's a done deal, but it is evolving, and Wowza and Haivision are adding capabilities to it and adapting it as it needs to. So tally and these other kind of things, it's an open protocol, as George said. There's many ways to insert differently packaged pieces of data across that link. And that's only going to expand as time goes on. So the protocol itself is evolving as we go forward.
Yeah. So another question here from Rob Diggerhuth, who good to see you, Rob. We usually only get to talk to you over emails, but great to see you here in the webinar. And he was just saying, can you show me directly in Perl 2 what sort of settings I need to utilize SRT? I know you posted that question before we got to some of those screenshots about configuring it. If that didn't clarify it for you, Rob, please, drop us a line, give me a call, give our support team a call, and we can kind of, maybe jump on a call with you, go into a little more detail. But in general, it depends on which mode, of course, you're using. Caller just needs to know the URL, IP, or DNS name of the remote listener. And that's pretty much it. It can be that basic. Of course, there's a lot of variables to that. So Another question here, what could cause a big delay, about 5 seconds, on a local network using SRT? Um, and what could cause an issue when trying to invert caller and listener role? I mean, if the delay would be set by your latency, and if your latency is being set that high, I would take a look at your round trip time to see if you actually have to set it that high. Again, SRT is based on what you choose as the latency. So depends on the gear you're using. If you're using equipment that doesn't give you that variable, it's just making up the latency on its own. That could be why. But certainly within the context of pearls, if you're on the same local network and your round trip time should be, really low, then you should be able to set your latency to, next to nothing, 50 millis, 60 milliseconds, 80 milliseconds easily, and be able to achieve that without a problem. So that's a hard one to answer directly, but I hope that gives you some insight. Stephen did post in chat in terms of his multi-audio question. SDI input for audio routing transport via SRT multi-audio. So do we support multiple SDI channels yet? No, we don't. We still just have a stereo pair there. We have not added multi-track audio into the streams yet, but technically that's another technology that is possible over SRT. One of the reasons why I asked you to clarify, Stephen, was that that's a thing that's not possible over legacy things like RTMP, really. So that's a place where these newer technologies and newer protocols like SRT are going to change the game for that a little bit, where previously in the live streaming world, it was limited by these ancient protocols like RTMP. And that includes a lot of things, newer codecs down the line, audio stuff down the line. So that's going to be, keep an eye on it, and things are going to change there, I think. Let's see. Nick asking here, would Epiphan ever make a standalone HDMI SRT encoder? Well, I think that answers its own question because we talked about Nano in the earlier slides. So check out Pearl Nano on our website. It's a product that is imminently being released. Although it has two inputs on it. It is a single channel encoder. It will support SRT, will support HDMI, but also supports SDI input as well. So check that out, and it is a standalone hardware encoder, of course. So it's the new baby brother in the Pearl family. So check that out, Nick, and see if that might fit what you're looking for. Cohen was asking, why not always use the rendezvous setting? Oh, and then commented afterward, answered. Yeah, so there's a number of reasons to not always use rendezvous. Stability-wise, it can be weird. IP addresses can change. For example, my home IP rarely changes, but it could. I could reboot my router right now, and my public IP would probably change. So that's why not to use rendezvous. And as I mentioned to the earlier question about mobile stuff, you don't always know what your true public IP is, but for rendezvous, you kind of have to. So it doesn't fit every scenario, despite its advantages of traversing firewalls on both ends really well. There's pieces of information that may not always be clear. So it's just more stable to look at caller listener sometimes, if that's possible. Nick's asking an interesting one. This is a good one, actually. Dave, maybe you want to answer this. What would give a better result over a local network, SRT or NDI-HX?
I think in the implementations we've seen of NDI-HX, I think you'll probably get a better result with SRT. NDI kind of native or regular NDI or whatever you want to call it,
not NDI or
not the HX flavor, tends to be quite low latency. But what we found in the HX, and it depends on what you're using to create that HX signal, but in a lot of cases, it's there is going to be a little bit more latency there. it's a it's a little tricky because it's normally that H.264 encoding that creates that latency, and whether that's then wrapped in SRT or whether that's wrapped in whether you're using NDI to create it. At that point, if you're using HX, then you're using H.264. So from a comparison point of view, the encoding delay should be similar. But what we found is, at least in the testing that we've done, is the NDI HX does have a little bit more latency than typical NDI. And depending on how you're encoding into SRT, you could get a better result. So it's hard for us to answer that definitively. I think both of them could achieve very similar results. In our experience, the HX stuff tends to have a little bit more latency than NDI. I've not spent much time myself looking at, how low can we push an SRT on a very local network. I don't know, George, whether you have any other experience there.
I mean, I think, quality-wise, latency-wise, they're going to be pretty similar, I suspect. I think the big advantage of NDI is obviously auto-discovery. You don't have to know any of the IPs or any of that stuff, which you would have to do with SRT. The flip side of that is I would argue that to some degree, NDI could maybe possibly be a little more flaky in terms of disconnecting or losing itself, or IPs changing if you're on DHCP or something like. There could be some weird stuff. SRT could suffer some of that too. So I think the question for me, because I think your latency and quality results could be pretty similar, for me it would come down to ease of use, in which case NDI wins, but also what you're doing with it. And one example there would be, let's just say your production hub is a Pearl 2 and you're trying to decide between cameras that can do SRT or cameras that can do NDI. And you want 6 of them. SRT wins. And the main reason for that is system performance, where NDI is much harder to decode in quantity than SRT is. And that comes down to hardware decoding, which NDI as an SDK technically doesn't really support. So it's more work for the production hub to use NDI than it would be to use SRT. So maybe that's a lot of layers and getting a little too into the weeds and nerdy on it, but that's part of the reality of maybe choosing those. So I guess long story short, Nick, if you talk about ease of use, NDI is amazing for the auto discovery. Like that's hand down the best part about NDI. But there might be some other negatives there compared to SRT, depending on what you're trying to do, which it could include. You said local network, but does that include VLANs on the local network you have to cross, and a bunch of other things that NDI is not good at? So yeah, just there's a bigger picture there to consider too, I think. Quick one here that's super easy to answer. Wasim was just asking, does Pearl Mini support SRT? Yes. Done. Yeah. Aaron was asking, can you share the equation for the connection tuning? We did earlier. If you missed that, I can go back to some of those slides where we talked about it. This is the chart, and I'll leave this up for a bit. Again, it's looking at your round trip time, which you can get from your stats, which we had a picture of the way Pearl stats look here. So you would look at your round trip time. In this example, that screenshot's showing 26 milliseconds. And then you would take your multiplier and depending on what your packet loss is, again, coming back to this example, we're sub 1% just. So we could do a multiplier of 3 and set our latency for somewhere in that 60 millisecond range, maybe 80 milliseconds, maybe 100 milliseconds, depending on what you want to do there. So I hope, Aaron, that answers that question on equations. I'll leave this chart up for a bit longer here. This is an interesting one, Dave. Maybe you can answer this one. Gerard was just asking, will CEA 608 and 708 ever be integrated into the Pearl series?
That is definitely something we're looking at. Yes. So 608 and 708 are caption oriented technology. So it's how to embed and display captions within a video stream. And I can say yes. Last year we announced, or I guess the beginning of this year, geez, it's been a long year. We announced our live script product. And that was kind of our first foray into transcriptions and that sort of thing. Definitely the roadmap, both for that product and eventually for Pearl, will be to support captioning, and it will definitely lead to us doing 608 and 708 style stuff. So I can't give you a specific date, but that is definitely on our radar. We got lots of people asking about it, and we've kind of already shown our hand that we care about transcriptions and captioning, so we're definitely headed down that road.
Right. Richard asked a question here. How does Pearl Nano compare to other hardware or software encoders for feeding a CDN? I mean, at a very general level, very comparable. And Pearl Nano can output RTMP, RTMPS, SRT, HLS, MPEG-Dash, basically using any of those protocols to feed the CDN that supports whichever one of those you choose. I can answer two questions, two birds with one stone here, because Nick also asked, does the Nano use H.264, H.265? And it's going to have H.264 at launch. And so, standard codec. So again, if your CDN is supporting H.264 and any of those protocols I mentioned, it's going to be comparable there. But like its Pearl brothers, it's going to have, the flexibility of you choosing your different encoding settings, manual bitrate settings to make sure it fits within, your bandwidth and other network things. So, I would say from a general perspective, feeding a CDN, very comparable to Pearl Mini and Pearl 2 for sure. And many hardware encoders are doing pretty similar. There might be things down the road, especially integrated with Epiphan Cloud, that could make some of that a bit easier in terms of integrations and stuff like that down the line, but that'll be later. Richard also asked pricing and availability of Pearl Nano. Richard, I'm not sure where you're located, so I can't really give you a straight answer on the pricing, but you can check out our product page. Someone did link it in the chat a little earlier. That's going to give you some specs and ideas. We sell all Pearl models through our regional partners globally, so they would have pricing for your area. There is a where to buy page on our website that can help you identify your most local regional partner. They've all been briefed and been given that pricing if they're an official partner, so they should have that information for you in order to get you that. Otherwise, send us an email, sales@epiphan.com, and our sales team can give you a hand with some of that. Rob was just saying, I don't understand how you get SRT into the Pearl as a source. I only see RTSP as an option in my Pearl 2. Rob, that's because you're running a firmware that's too old. You need to update. SRT was introduced in firmware 4.12, which was released this past summer. We're on 4.12.1, and in a couple of weeks we'll be on 4.13. So if you're not seeing SRT or NDI as an input option, then you are quite behind in firmware version. You'll definitely want to update. Matt was asking the same question we answered earlier. What's the highest quality? Could be 4K, could be high bit rate. This question, I'm actually, maybe you can clarify in chat if you're still there. Will you be implementing multiplexing using Stream ID if not already? I'm not sure I understand that question. Maybe clarify in the chat there quickly. The other question was, have you experimented with Haivision SRT gateway? Thoughts on implementing server in listener mode and everything else in caller mode? I personally haven't played with SRT gateway. Have you touched on it at all, Dave?
I haven't actually kind of got my fingers on it. I've read lots about it and talked to people about it, and I think that's exactly the way I would use it. If I was connecting kind of contribution feeds, I would definitely have them in caller mode and have the listener mode on the SRT hub side or gateway side. And that just makes things very, very easy. The way we've done it here is we even just have, a URL that is DNSable into the IP address. So you can just give those out to the callers and have the remote machines just plug in that URL, and then they're going to connect. And that's by far the easiest way if you're dealing with something like an SRT hub or some kind of static server. That's definitely the way to go.
Yeah. No, it makes complete sense. Again, something like Haivision's SRT gateway might not be for everyone. It depends on what your infrastructure is, what you're trying to do. We're Epiphan. We're going to use Epiphan equipment, which is why we use a Pearl 2 as our hub essentially. But again, it's doing something kind of very similar to that concept of a server as the listener and the callers are coming into it. So absolutely, that's a valid workflow. It's just a choice of which points are fit your needs the best. I suspect, Haivision is, as a company, outside of developing cool tech like SRT, but their products, they're gained for pretty much the top level, right? Like they're not aiming at the low or the middle level. They're looking at the absolute top level of backbone infrastructure. So it kind of depends on, where you're at in that line of whether or not their products are right for you versus something like a Pearl 2. Okay, interesting. There was a clarification here. Multiplex allows for one port and multiple streams, and this was announced in 1.3, I believe. I guess SRT version 1.3.
Okay.
So, generally we will be keeping pace with SRT versions. I don't think we're at 1.3 yet. I don't recall off the top of my head.
No, and I haven't had any requests for that yet. So that's an interesting question for us. We're always curious to see, as these protocols, whether it's NDI, SRT, they're all evolving, and knowing which kind of features and pieces of that protocol our users are very interested in is great. This is the first time I've had anyone ask me specifically about multiplexing multiple streams inside of an ID. So I don't have an answer of whether we'll do it yet, but it's great that you brought it up because we are keen to kind of understand who needs it, and more than that, even understanding under which kind of applications you see the need for it is helpful too. So
as always, we love feedback. So we would love to learn more about your use case and how that type of a feature would specifically help you. So if you want to send us an email, with any follow-up on that, you can email us at info@epiphan.com. That's something we can pass along to the team and take a look at and follow up with you. We always like to hear about how people are already using or planning on using our products or some of the features that they include. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like, and we can continue that conversation. So the last one here, Ivan was saying, and he prefaced this slightly off topic, but maybe a brief answer. Pearl 2 and RTMPS and WebRTC input as a choice. Upcoming firmware or not on the horizon at all. Thanks for this session, gents. And that is the last question that we're going to take. Basically, will we ever do RTMP/RTMPS or WebRTC as input options as opposed to NDI or SRT, which are already there? I don't know if you want to answer that one, Dave, or not, but
yeah, again, it is one we've had from a number of customers, particularly the WebRTC option. People looking to bring in remote guests. That's a really convenient way for that remote guest to just fire up a browser and be able to connect that way. Doesn't always provide the same level of control and quality as SRT that we've been talking about here today, but it's definitely a convenient option. It's on our roadmap. Again, I can't tell you today exactly when you'll see it, but it is definitely something we've heard a number of customers ask about, and we see the value in that. Absolutely, just increasing the ways and the number of ways that users can connect into Pearl, that's definitely coming.
Yeah, and the flip side to that is, as Dave mentioned, we've definitely had people ask about WebRTC. The flip side to that, you also asked about RTMP. Quite honestly, considering that SRT is there now, I don't really see the practicality of adding, quite honestly, an inferior protocol compared to what's there now. SRT is going to be much lower latency, give you a bunch of controls, and better diagnostic feedback and things like that, where RTMP is kind of a step backwards from that in a lot of respects. So, I can understand people, and people have asked about it. I personally, my personal opinion, not represented by Epiphan or blah, 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 is that doesn't really, I don't really see that makes a lot of sense considering what's already there with SRT. But with WebRTC, yeah, I could definitely see the argument with that, and that's why we have been looking at it.
Yep.
So that's great. That's the final question. Not going to take any more questions because we do have to wrap up today, people. Appreciate your time. Appreciate you joining us. So as always, if you have questions, feedback, you want to request a demo from our sales team, you want to check out our products, go to the website, epiphan.com/products. You can email us, info@epiphan.com. Of course, you can always follow, like, subscribe, and all the socially things that we do, including our Live at Epiphan show that we do on Thursdays. And, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook, you'll see those notifications. We're always covering in shorter, more condensed shows, something about streaming, which is always a good time. And we do post, I see Gerard asking, we do post these webinars as VOD on our YouTube channel. It might take a day or two to be up there, but we do post them. And we also post them on our website at epiphan.com/webinars, which is also where you will see the back catalog, upcoming things you can register for, and what we have coming. So once again, thanks, Dave, and thanks everyone for watching. This is great. I hope everyone learned something, which is the final poll question. Weigh in on that. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.